So Jason Schreier recently put out a video on a topic that I think a lot of people have sort of been considering for a while, which is that, if all these big gaming companies have been complaining about the cost of games development getting just so expensive recently, why don't they just make cheaper games? Like if a game costs $500 million to make, like who is forcing them to spend that much money on a game? I'm not even saying they need to like lay off half their workforce. Why not just make two smaller games for $250 million or a bajillion indie games for $10 each? And this video isn't really meant to be a rebuttal or anything. If anything, I just kind of wanted to join in on this conversation since I think it is an interesting topic. So I do recommend checking out Schreier's original video, and I'll put a link in the description for you, as he does kind of provide a good baseline explanation for why so many big companies and CEOs seem to think the way they do. And just to quickly summarize it for those that don't want to go back and watch that, oftentimes, at least in their perspective, a bigger game can just be seen as a safer bet. Sure, you spend more money on one big project, but in doing so, you're able to fund the creation of more features that you can use as selling points to advertise and thus draw in a bigger audience and overall get a bigger return on investment, especially if we're talking about big name franchises, World of Warcraft, Halo, whatever. If you have a franchise that is practically guaranteed to sell a ton of copies, well then why are we bothering to put money into anything else when we could just be putting more money into this big project that's probably going to sell way better? And on top of that, when you look at the indie scene, there are tons of really cheaply made indie games that became mega hits, Balatro, Undertale, just recently, Mecha Chameleon. And those games are making gangbusters. But for every one of those successful indie games that exist, there are literally like thousands, if not tens of thousands, of other small indie games that aren't even bad necessarily. I'm sure plenty of them are, but also plenty of them might be great. But they just end up getting drowned out by the competition, and they get forgotten about with time. And so as a result, going for these sort of smaller budget projects can feel like a lottery. There's no guarantee that any one of them will succeed, even if you make a bunch of them. And not to mention, on top of that, you can split up things like engineering resources, marketing budgets, stuff like that. Like if you're paying for an ad spot at the Game Awards, that's costing like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars for like 60 seconds of advertisement budget. So like, are you going to spend that ad time, which also other people are going to be bidding for? So it's not like you could just buy more of it if you can afford it. So like, are you going to spend that ad time on one big project that you can try to display as much as possible in order to get more people to buy it? Or are you going to try and split up that already limited 60 seconds into like 10 6-second ads for smaller games? So like there are some logical sort of sound reasonings that kind of explain why so many big companies want to spend all of this money on big projects. But even in that video, Schreier himself is pretty skeptical of the reasoning, because that also there are lots of examples of not even indie but like smaller projects that did end up doing really well without necessarily hampering their ability to produce big projects like Hearthstone. And one thing I think that contributed to this mindset that so many big corporations are sort of stuck in these days is that I think it used to be a lot more true that spending more money resulted in like just a better project. Because if you think about, if we turn the clock back like 30 years to like the 90s, right? In this era of gaming, and this also extends a little bit to like the 80s and the 2000s as well, this sort of early era was going through a period of frankly absurd, explosive technological growth. Every couple of years, it felt like they were completely redefining what a game could even be back then. Like spending, and as a result, like, you had to spend more money in order to try and keep up with the competition. Like, think about the difference in quality just within a single console generation. Like, the first games released on, like, the NES or SNES compared to what they looked like at the end of that console's lifespan. And then, of course, the jump in quality from one console to the next, going from the 8-bit era to the 16-bit era, and then jumping to the first 3D games with the very primitive technology of the time, but it was still a huge leap compared to the 2D games. And then, of course, as 3D games evolved very rapidly and got way higher in fidelity, more complex texture mapping, and higher polygon counts, more complicated animation rigging technologies, every couple of years. Like, hell, just look at, like, the Final Fantasy series. Like, we went from, what, Final Fantasy VI came out in 1994, and Final Fantasy X came out in 2001. That's like 7 years. And 6-ish games coming out every couple of years, and every single one of them felt like a massive, like, going from, like, 6 to 7 with the jump to 3D, and then advancing in 3D from, like, 7 to 8, and then 9 being this, like, referential, like, retro thing, and then 10, once again, on the PS2, another huge jump. Like, so, every year, it was new and cutting edge. And so, if you didn't spend as much money as you could making your game as good looking as possible, making the world as big as you could make it, then it would look like you were being left in the dust. You know, why would anybody bother even looking at your game if it looks like last gen's leftovers, you know? So I think that's kind of where this mindset sort of comes from, at least in the gaming space specifically. But the problem with that mindset is that I think we've kind of moved on from that era in gaming. We, like, ever since, like, I want to say, like, the 7th generation, you know, the 360 PS3 generation, I feel like that was kind of the tipping point where that period of explosive growth kind of started to taper off. And, like, obviously things still continue to improve, technology continues to advance, but we've reached a point of diminishing returns on that technology. The jump in quality from the earliest versions of 3D graphics from, like, the N64 and PS1 era to, you know, the PS2 and the GameCube, like, those were massive jumps. And then going from the PS2 to the PS3, you know, like, that like, going for, like, HD, pushing more pixels, like, that was a pretty big jump. And then going from the PS3 to the PS4, it's like, well, okay, well, we were already doing, like, HD graphics and stuff, and, like, I guess some games could hit, like, 4K, but, like, most games didn't, and, like, there's more polygons on screen. I'm not saying it's not better, but... And then you go from the PS4 to the PS5, and it's like, yeah, like, you could tell there's a difference, like, there's, like, some better lighting and stuff, but, like, as things get more and more advanced and closer to, you know, this idea of, like, photorealistic graphics, the amount of effort that it takes to make an actually, like, noticeable change in graphical fidelity gets exponentially more expensive. And so as a result, from the consumer's point of view, it looks like there's just not really much of a selling point anymore to trying to claim you have the best graphics, especially because, you know, when you think about it, usually the best looking games don't even bother going for realism. A lot of games just kind of stopped bothering to chase that trend, and as a result they go for a much cheaper looking art style by being more cartoony. And, like, not only does it allow you to stand out from the competition by not trying to push hyper-realistic human models and whatnot, but it also allows you to save a ton of money, and it looks more timeless than a realistic art style. And so as a result, you know, this chase of trying to chase, like, the greatest, hardest, most polygons ever, you know, spending as much money as possible to push every single pixel to their limit, it just isn't really worth it anymore, I don't think. And so I think that, like, from this graphical perspective, like, it just doesn't really make sense to keep trying to push graphics as hard as possible when, like, like, is the average consumer really going to notice the difference anymore? Like, really? If I have to go to like Digital Foundry or something to have them explain to me why this game looks better than the game that came out 2 years ago, I don't think it's worth it to push those graphics anymore. And like, even if we limit our scope to like games that have to have like these realistic sort of looking human models, there are games like Expedition 33, for example, that like that's one of the best looking games I've seen in years. The art direction is amazing, and there's so many crazy cool environments that you get to explore, and the characters and the non-human models also look great too. And that game reportedly cost less than $10 million to develop, which is by no means like indie level budget, but like compared to the hundreds of millions of dollars that it takes to develop most AAA games, like what are we doing here? Like clearly budget has no real bearing on graphical fidelity anymore, and I think the same is true for a lot of the other things that used to be selling points in a lot of games. The size of a game is a big one now, because it used to be back in the day like, oh, we would advertise, oh, this is the biggest game world we've ever developed, this is the biggest game world of all time, things like that. And nowadays we have games like Starfield, and it's like, oh, you've got thousands of planets to explore, so it's like it's technically bigger than a ton of other games combined. It's bigger than every other Bethesda game ever combined, and yet a lot of people just aren't impressed by that anymore, because we know about things like procedural generation that can be used to essentially make a game's world as arbitrarily large as you want it. There was no reason why Starfield had to stop at 1,000 planets. It could have been 1,000,000 planets. I mean, hell, that's basically No Man's Sky, has a bajillion planets to explore, and that came out like a decade before Starfield. So like, this has been true. Hell, it's technically been true for basically all of gaming history, because this isn't even a new technology. Elder Scrolls 2, way back in the day, used procedural generation to have an absolutely enormous game world that was like the actual size of like Great Britain or something like that. And that was like a really old game from like the 90s, so... But it has just gotten more and more obvious as time has gone on. Like, I think consumers have kind of wisened up a little that this claim of making such a big game world just isn't the selling point it used to be. So spending all this money trying to make your game as big as possible doesn't really matter if you fill it with nothing of note. So, like, the two biggest selling points of games back then, in like the 90s, during this period of growth, just aren't really selling points that are tied to a game's budget anymore. And as a result, when you don't have these sort of objective qualifiers that you can use as selling points, everything else is kind of just left to subjective things, like the actual design of the game. Like, I guess you could still go by the amount of content, like the playtime of a game, like how long it takes to beat, but even then, that can be a fairly nebulous concept. Like, okay, it's easy to sort of measure how much content like an RPG or straightforward linear action game might have, and so you could just do a bunch of testing and say, oh, this game is 30 hours long or whatever, right? But like, what about a card game? Or roguelike, or lots of other games that have like a ton of replayability. Devil May Cry is a linear action game with a fairly short story, but it's also like endlessly replayable. And hell, even something as simple as adding a Bloody Palace mode could add hundreds of hours of gameplay to a game that you could beat in under 10. And stuff like that can be super cheap to add. Like, that's why they add things like Bloody Palace mode to Devil May Cry, because that basically costs nothing to develop, because it's all just reusing assets that you used elsewhere in the game. And yet it adds tons and tons of time to a game's playtime. So, like, your budget is no longer tied to the quality of your visuals, the size of your world, the amount of playtime that the game has. So, like, at that point, all that really matters is the actual, like, design of the game and how good it is. And I think we all know for certain at this point that spending more money doesn't magically make a game better. I mean, how many, like, hundreds of millions of dollars need to go up in flames with games that come out and get shut down overnight because they just flopped on release? Like, it's pretty evident at this point that I think this mentality of trying to spend the most money making the biggest game just isn't really worth it anymore. And when people like me say that these companies should be making smaller games, that doesn't necessarily have to mean, indie level. Like, maybe just instead of spending, $300 million, spend like $100 million. Is it really going to make that much of a difference in terms of the quality of the final product? I mean, so many games out there 100% could have been a better product if they were reduced in scope and cost less to make. I mentioned Starfield already, that I legitimately feel could have been a lot better if they just limited the scope of the game to just a handful of solar systems that were much more detailed and handcrafted, instead of trying to bloat out the game with 1,000 random planets that are completely meaningless. And I mean, Ubisoft is a gold mine for this kind of design problem, where how many open world games have you played that even if the core gameplay is good and you enjoy the story, it's just bloated to hell and back with hundreds, if not thousands, of minor objectives and collectibles just strewn out across the map that most players just do not care about. I remember this even with like Horizon, and I love that game, but I still feel like it had this like open world bloat that if they just didn't include that stuff, the game would be a lot more concise and probably cost a lot less to develop, and it would be an overall better product at the end of the day. And I think that few people would disagree with me on that. But even if we do talk about this idea of like a AAA publisher making or funding a indie scale project, I don't think that the argument that, well, indie games are just a lottery, you can't rely on success, I don't even think that's necessarily true, for at least when we're talking about the idea of a big company making a small game. Because the main reason why indie games can feel like such a lottery is because of marketing, or rather the lack thereof. Most indie games don't have any kind of budget for marketing. The best they can hope for is to just drop their trailer on YouTube with a channel that probably has like even fewer subscribers than I do, and hope that it just finds an audience. Maybe they can send a free copy to a couple of streamers and hope that they play it, maybe, and that's kind of it. So getting your game out there is the problem. That's why so many games, regardless of their quality, will be released on Steam and then just immediately forgotten about, because there's just too many of them to compete with. Whereas when we're talking about a big budget studio, even if they're not funneling that money that they have into this indie project, like, I'm not saying that they need to buy like a $10 million ad spot just for this game that cost $1 million to make, but there is a certain amount of leverage that they're able to apply just by the virtue of their size. Like, if Sony funded an indie game, right, they could just release a trailer to their official YouTube channel, and that alone, simply posting to the official PlayStation YouTube channel, or even including it in a state of play, which again, because it's their own event, that functionally costs them nothing, as far as I'm aware at least. So, like, that kind of like advertising, like, would be pennies on the dollar if it even costs anything, but it would also give that small budget game a million times better of a chance of success than 99% of other indie games who are not going to have that level of like clout to build off of. The mere fact that it's being released by a big company like Sony or Xbox or Capcom or whatever would like inherently help that game succeed. Hell, even if we're talking about this idea of like just sending a free copy to streamers, which again literally only costs you one sale because you're just giving your game away for free, a streamer, whether they're big or small, is far more likely to pay attention to a free game that's being sent to them by like Capcom or whatever than they are to pay attention to some random no-name indie dev that they've never heard of before. So like, again, like, simply being a big company makes the idea of a smaller budget game much more likely to succeed. I'm not going to say it's guaranteed. Nothing's a guarantee in this business. But to act like it's the exact same lottery that it would be if they were to make like an indie game compared to like a normal average person like myself making an indie game, it's just not equivalent. And I can also just see a lot of sort of middle ground solutions that a large company could use and leverage their finances and resources that an indie studio just wouldn't have access to do things like hell, take UFO 50 for example, which still boggles my mind that was made by such a small team, but like that's a collection of 50 like really small, like not quite like WarioWare level micro games, but like each of the 50 games are real small indie games. And I think that like if you had a bunch of developers, like this huge dev team, and then instead of having them make 100 tiny, you know, indie games that would in theory be competing with each other, you could bundle them all up into one package and be like, hey, here's PlayStation 50, here's Nintendo 64. Maybe go with a different naming scheme, but you know, they could literally just do that and then sell that as one full-priced game, but it contains, you know, 50, 100, however many smaller indie games made by like what would have been one big dev just split up into like 100 small teams and working on this. Or hell, you could even kind of do like imagine if a studio did like a game jam and they just took a break from like the big projects they were working on and just let everybody do like split up into small teams and just basically work on whatever they wanted for like a week or two. And then at the end of that, they would have all of these little prototypes of all these cool little games, and then you could have a tournament of, or not even a tournament, but just like a review going through like, oh, like whose games are the best and whatnot. You could take the top 5 games and then spin those off into new projects that maybe get a little bit more of a budget to be completed and brought to the finish line. Like that I feel could be an interesting strategy that again, like you can't really do that with like an indie dev, but it would allow these companies to leverage their scope and scale to sort of field test, you know, dozens of ideas at the same time to look for those like diamonds in the rough that have a lot more potential way more quickly. But yeah, overall though, it's just like I can understand why companies would want to spend so much money on certain kinds of projects, especially if it's for a really strong IP that they own, and they want to try and ensure that it does as well as possible to keep the brand strong, because those are much more surefire bets. But like, we still see this mentality even when we're talking about completely brand new IPs, you know, like Concord and Highguard and countless others. Also, I've made a different video about this, how this sort of influx of everybody chasing the highest ROI and thus chasing the live service market. It's a self-defeating strategy, because again, the world can only support so many live service games at the same time that it becomes literally impossible to like break into a market without taking down somebody who's already there, right? There's only so many hours in the day for the average user. So if everybody is going for the biggest budget live service, blah, 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 you're just going to flood the market and get into the same problem that the indie market has, except you're losing hundreds of millions of dollars per attempt instead of just a couple million, you know? So like, they're kind of creating their own problem. And I feel like, at the very least, going for a smaller budget project means you're not going to lose as much in the attempt, and then you could expand upon it later if you need to. And going for these mid-budget projects can also allow for a little bit more risk and a little bit more originality, you know, trying to actually stand out from the competition instead of just trying to make whatever is popular. Because that just, like, it's a very simple line of thought that I don't think holds up to scrutiny, to just always go for the biggest trend, especially because trends change too quickly for big budget games to respond to them. You know, when Battle Royales got big, hell, when hero shooters got big before Battle Royales, right, with Overwatch, like Concord was made as a direct response to Overwatch back in 2016, and it took that game like 8 years to come out because of how big the budget was and how wide the scope was. And as a result, the entire trend, like, basically came and went and kind of shifted entirely. And, like, obviously we still got, like, Marvel Rivals and stuff, but, like, to spend 8 years chasing a trend, you know, and the same thing with, like, Battle Royales, extraction shooters, like, if you want to try and make something that competes with the most popular genre of the day, you can't spend 6, 7, 8 years trying to chase that trend on a single game. You need to have a smaller, faster turnaround to even hope of catching that wave. But yeah, and like, just as one last thing that I want to talk about, I haven't really mentioned Nintendo a whole lot in this discussion so far, and I feel like, well, sure, Nintendo they are pretty cagey with their development numbers, but we could still make some pretty reasonable guesses, and I don't think Nintendo really succumbs to this, like, you know, gotta make the biggest game ever and spend hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars per release. Like, I don't think they succumb to that line of thinking, at least not anymore. Ever since, like, the Wii, I guess, like 20 years ago now. Because ever since that generation, Nintendo has stopped, you know, they stopped designing their consoles to try and be the strongest consoles ever. They focus instead on having strong art styles that are a lot more timeless than trying to push for the most polygons on screen. And as a result, you know, their consoles are consistently the cheapest out of the bunch by a pretty significant margin. And that's even accounting for the fact that Nintendo doesn't sell their consoles at a loss. The other manufacturers, Xbox and PlayStation, they sell their consoles at a loss to make back money on software sales. Nintendo is the only one that doesn't do that. And yet they still are able to have their consoles be significantly cheaper because they don't care about trying to go for the biggest power budget out of all the consoles. And as a result, they also were able to make their games for a lot cheaper. You know, it's been estimated that Breath of the Wild only cost, like, what, $120-ish million, which, like, that is definitely a AAA scale budget, don't get me wrong. And again, that number comes from a variety of sources and experts making estimations. It is by no means definitive, but it's still a lot lower than the hundreds of millions of dollars that a lot of other more recent games cost. You know, and then Tears of the Kingdom probably cost less than that, given that it reused a lot of the same assets from Breath of the Wild. Like, I can't imagine that games like Mario Odyssey cost, you know, as much as Concord to develop. And as a result, Nintendo's been trucking along just fine. You know, Nintendo consistently rakes in money hand over fist with no issues, and has been doing so probably the most consistently out of any of the manufacturers. I'm not going to say that they're perfect, but clearly they're doing something right, if you ask me. But yeah, I think I'll end it there for today. So as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. By all means, if you can think of any more reasons why these huge companies should be spending hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on single projects, then let me know, or reasons why they shouldn't. You know, there's probably a million other factors to consider that I haven't even thought of yet. So by all means, I'm curious to hear more people's takes on this. And if you like the video, make sure to leave me a like and hit that subscribe button if you want to see more content like this in the future. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.